I gotta confess to you this morning, I am intimidated by cars. I'm not a car guy. I think this is a result of a couple things. One, I'm not a good driver. I'm just not. I'm just gonna admit it. And second, I have no intuitive sense on how a car works or how you can go about fixing it, right? I grew up around guys, good old boys in the country, and man, it just seemed like there was something in their DNA that made them able to intuitively understand a car and how it works. They had a confidence to mess with things and tinker with it. That's not me at all, right? I don't understand anything. I don't like it. And for the longest time, I refused to even touch it until YouTube. Now with YouTube, I've kind of figured a couple things out that I could do here and there, but nothing big. I'm not a big car guy. I'm just intimidated by it. First of all, I'm not a good driver, okay? So some people might be chick magnets. I'm a cop magnet. I do the same things I see you do when you're driving. I do the same things I see my wife do when she's driving, yet somehow I'm always the one who get pulled over, right? I got pulled over, I got a ticket for impeding traffic because I was going too slow. Now, I'm just telling you, over the years, I've invested more into car insurance than I have ever even come close to investing in my 401k. It's insane. I keep waiting for it to go down because a ticket will roll off or a violation will roll off. I mean, it's getting a little bit better, but I'm just not a good driver. I'm not a good driver, too, because I fall asleep when I drive. Does anybody else have this issue? I mean, put me in a car and I start driving and I'm going to pass out. It's horrible. When we go on road trips, I have to have about 100 ounces of liquid. I got a water, a Diet Pepsi, and a black coffee. And then I got hot Cheetos, Sour Patch Kids, and some beef jerky. And it's all consumed in about 30, 45 minutes. Like, I need whatever it takes to keep me awake. I blame my father for this. My mom worked night shifts when I was a baby, so he would be the one who had to put me to bed at night. And instead of swaddling or rocking and dealing with that whole thing, he just put me in the car and drove around the neighborhood until I fell asleep. And so now it's just a part of who I am. When the car starts moving, I pass out. And scares my wife to death, right? But still, she lets me drive. I don't get it. But I'm intimidated by cars too. I don't understand how they work. I don't get them. And I just assume that it is what it is when something's wrong with them. There's something you have to deal with. I don't know if you have things like this, but my dad, he is an intuitive guy, or he was. When he was alive, he just could fix anything. He could touch anything. He had like this magic touch and he could fix it. So he gets in my car one day and we're driving and I hit a bump. And it's like just a little pothole, a normal pothole. But it shakes the car like we've been hit by an RPG rocket launcher. I mean, the whole thing just shakes back and forth. And he freaks out. He's like, "What is wrong with your car?" I was like, "Dad, that's just the way cars are." He's like, "No, this is not." And I was like, "Yeah, it's an old car, Dad. You can't expect it to be like your nice new cars," because he always had nicer cars. I said, "It's not going to be that way. It's just, this is what it is. It is what it is when it comes to old cars." He goes, "Son, can you please just take this to the mechanic and see what's wrong?" I said, "Fine, whatever." So I took it to the mechanic. Turns out I had overinflated my tires. Did you even know that was possible? I didn't know. I just figured the more air you put in, the longer it would be before you had to put more air in it, right? But when you overinflate your tires, there has no give when you hit things in the road. Go see. It was a very cheap date with the mechanic that day. Another time he got in the car and it was raining outside and I had like a little sunroof, and it had a little drip to it. Now I had addressed this issue. I had a cup and a towel there to catch the water, right? That's what you do. He's like, "Son, why don't you get this fixed?" I was like, "Dad, you can't. It's just an old car. It costs thousands of dollars. It is what it is." "No, son, it is not what it is. Please go get this fixed." I was like, "Dad, I'm not spending that kind of money. It's just an old car." He does what he does, and which some of you can do, where he like has voodoo, and he looks at it, he like touches it, and then he punches it. If I punched it, it would have broken, but he punches it, it knocks it back on track, and it's fixed in 5 seconds. I had moldy carpets for months, right? And he just fixes it all of a sudden. No big deal, right? Another time, and there's multiple times he's gotten in the car and said, "What is wrong with your car?" Another time, He got in, I turned on the car, and it sounded like a flock of birds were in my engine. Have you ever heard this? Like, I had just learned to turn up the radio. Then you don't hear it, right? You don't even notice it if the music's loud enough. Son, what is wrong with you? It's like, Dad, it's just an old car. Old cars make noise. Don't worry about it. He said, please go to the mechanic and see what's wrong with this thing. Turned out it's the serpentine belt. I don't know if you all know what this is, but the mechanic, it was like $150 to fix it. But he said, had you gone a little bit longer, it would have been thousands of dollars to fix it, right? Because I had just been content to ignore it. Do you do this in any area of your life? Do you have an area of your life you're not skilled in, or you're not confident and expert in it, and so you just kind of deal with it? You just make do. You're okay with it. It is what it is, perhaps, is what you say about it. I met a friend in my 20s, and this friend, after getting to know him a little while, had this thing on their lip, and it was a fever blister. And I mean, I had seen fever blisters before in my life, but this was awful. It blistered, it grew, it caused them intense pain for weeks, and it just looked like there was a little creature living on their lip. I was like, eventually I just had to say something because I couldn't look at it anymore, and I just felt awful for them. I said, have you had that looked at? Like, have you gone to a doctor and done anything about it? And they said, no, it's just a fever blister. I was like, I know, but I think they can do something for that. This person goes, no, my grandfather had them. They were horrible for him. My mother had them. They were horrible for her. I had them when I was a kid. It is what it is. It's just you have to learn to deal with it. I was like, please, at least for everybody else's sake, can you just ask the doctor if there is anything they can do? Well, even to this day, and that was 20 years ago, to this day, that person thanks me when they see me because they say, I had no idea. Apparently, they have a pill that if you take the pill, it alleviates and strongly diminishes the effect of the fever blister. It changed this person's life. Why is it that we're so content, though, sometimes to just say, it is what it is? We increasingly live in a fatalistic culture. You can feel it in the air. There's a lack of hope. There's a lack of belief that things can change. And we have sayings like, it is what it is, that help us sort of accommodate this. Now, there's probably moments in your life where it's okay to say, it is what it is, right? There's a difficult thing, something you have to accommodate it, and saying that helps you say, there's just some things in life that you can't change. But what Jim and I, when we started working on this series, we're sensing is that it's more than just small things. It's as a people, as a culture, we're increasingly becoming despondent, cynical. We lack a belief that things can get better, especially the younger you go in the generations. The younger generation, Gen Z, just has a lack of belief that things can get better. And what Jim and I have been wanted to talk about in this series is that for Jesus followers, there's no saying it is what it is. All right, so can you say that with me? Say, it is what it is. Now, don't say it again, right? Because for people who follow Jesus, we have a different way of understanding and looking at the world. We have a different way of experiencing the things that happen in the world around us. And we are the people who should be proclaiming, it is not what it is. Say that with me. It is not what it is. We should not be the people who say it is what it is. We are the people of hope. For centuries upon centuries, followers of Jesus were known as people of hope, which makes sense, right? I mean, we proclaim a risen Savior, that he died and that he rose and that his Spirit lives among us and in us. We proclaim that nothing is impossible for God. Christianity was born in adversity. Think about that. The freedom and the accommodation that we have for our faith and our culture is nothing like the beginning, the roots and the foundation of Christianity. They were born in adversity, and for the first centuries were a persecuted minority. Even still today throughout the world, there are Christians who cling to hope because it is literally all they have. They believed in and trusted Paul's words when he says, "So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is unseen is eternal." Or since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. For we live by faith, not by sight. I mean, think about how powerful those words would have been to the early Christians who were being persecuted, killed, murdered by the Roman government. You would have clung to those because your present circumstances, they aren't telling you the full story. And what's amazing is that not only did Christians survive because of the hope that they had, but they flourished and they grew. The potential for the Christian movement to be snuffed out because of the present circumstances that they experienced was so high. So much adversity, so much coming against them. Yet, they had this radical hope that enabled them to keep on going. And not only to keep on going, but to grow and to flourish. How then is it possible that Christians, followers of Jesus today, are just as likely to proclaim, "It is what it is," as anyone in the broader culture? How come followers of Jesus seem plagued by the same fatalism and cynicism that seems to be the norm of the day? How is that even possible? In fact, I would argue there are some subsets of Christian culture that are more cynical, more fatalistic, more despondent than even the broader culture is. But how is that possible? Those two things don't make sense. We are the people of radical hope. That's how you define who we are. So how do we look exactly like the culture sometimes? How is it possible? I would suggest that we've almost created a new brand of Christianity, like Christian materialists. A materialist is a person who just believes in what they see. If they see it, if they experience it, if they can touch it, it's real, and there's nothing that exists beyond that. Is it possible that Christians have become almost materialists? That they proclaim God's goodness, God's faithfulness, God's ability to change only that which they see. That is, their experience in this life determines how much power God has, determines how sovereign God is. Their experience of the world is determinative of what they believe God can do. But that's not who we are. That's not what we're about. We are the people of radical hope. We are the people who are defined by illogical joy. Forget that. Our joy does not make sense. We're the people who are defined by unwavering faith, who are defined by irrational love. This series, then, is a reminder to us that it is not what it is. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 13, he says, "For now we see through a mirror dimly." That is, we don't see the full picture. Now, that doesn't make sense to us because today we have some really nice mirrors, do we not? I mean, your mirror can have a light in it. It can be surrounded in lights. It's like HD, 4K mirrors. I mean, they're beautiful. Sometimes what I can see in the mirror is I just don't want to see it that clearly, right? I look at it, I'm like, I'd prefer a little darker picture. And I don't want to see that, right? Like, we got some nice mirrors. Okay, that's not what Paul had, right? Paul didn't have these glass fancy mirrors. In Paul's day, a mirror was very dim. It would distort the picture. It didn't give you a true sense of what you were looking at. It was literally looking through a mirror or a glass dimly. That's who the people of Jesus are. We can see enough of what God is doing to declare that what we experience is not the full picture. We don't know the whole picture. We don't get it all. It doesn't all make sense. But we see enough to say, God is doing something new. God is at work in this place. So over the next couple weeks, we're going to take a look at the 7 signs in the Gospel of John. Gospel of John makes a point to call these miracles, what we often refer to as miracles, he calls them signs. And that might even be the better interpretation of how miracles used throughout the New Testament. He calls them signs because he wants the reader and the listener to know that these are just indications that Jesus is ushering in a new age. The point is not the miracle. The point is that God is up to something. And the miracle should indicate to the reader, to the listener, to the watcher in the original context, that God is moving, that God is up to something. And to think about them as signs and not as miracles is helpful to me because I don't often see miracles. But I do see signs. I do see indications that God is at work, that God is moving, that God is up to something. So, let's jump in with this week's sign. We're going in reverse order. This is John's 6th sign. This is the healing of the blind man. And it starts in John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth, he being Jesus. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, you got to use your imagination here for a second, but I kind of see the disciples walking up, kind of approaching this blind man. And I can almost hear one of them say, oh man, that's so sad, another blind beggar, because there was plenty of them in Jesus' day. Another blind beggar, he says, and the other one maybe responds something like, what do you do? They're everywhere. It is what it is, right? But then this third disciple maybe kind of chimes in and throws this question to Jesus. He says, Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man who sinned that made him be born blind? Or was it his parents? Now, what you need to know is that this is a very rabbi religious kind of move here. This is like this disciple kind of trying to be the smart kid in the class, to kind of posit themselves as the philosophical, let's have a deep philosophical, theological conversation about what's going on here. Because in Jesus' day, and in the days prior to Jesus' day, there was a clear understanding that people had that to whatever extent you suffered in this life, especially if you suffered greatly, so a man being blind, that is your fault. Your sin caused that, or your parents' sin caused that. This was such a deep ingrained thought that there was a line of thought that said a person could sin in utero. They could be in their mama's belly and sin, and that sin would cause them to be born blind. So that's the context of what this disciple's saying. So this disciple's essentially trying to have a theological conversation about this man's suffering. He's like, Teacher, did this man sin in his mother's womb, or was it his parents' sin who caused him to be that way? Here sits this man suffering, and the disciples want to have a philosophical conversation about his suffering. I almost want to get angry at the disciples in this moment, except for the fact that I do the same thing. And maybe you do too. That when we see suffering, when things are difficult, when things don't make sense, oftentimes our first inclination is to have philosophical, theological debates about why things are the way it is. We want to debate why it is the way it is. So we do it in conversations with friends. We do it in small groups. We do it in a Bible study. Sometimes I even find myself doing it in a sermon. We do it in committees. We do it in our politics, especially our 24-hour news cycle. We do it. We just want to talk about why it is the way it is. And then we can be tempted to go like the disciples, where we start blaming and pointing, well, it is the way it is, because that person's doing this, or that group of people is acting this way. So it is the way it is because of them, because of their sin. But I was just struck when I read this over and over. This blind man is sitting in the dark, and the disciples want to talk about why. They want to talk about why he's in the dark, as opposed to turning on the lights. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't play this game. In verse 3, he says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." And then he goes on, said Jesus, "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed for him." Now, I need to confess something to you right here this morning. I'm a pastor. I love the Bible. I love Jesus, but I do not like this response from Jesus. This is not my favorite response in the world that he makes. Because, honestly, he kind of skirted the question. In fact, maybe he even lied a little bit, if you can say Jesus lied. I'm not saying Jesus lied, but because they're not wrong. If I were Jesus, this is how I would have answered it. I would have said, yes, it was his parents who sinned, but it was his great, 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 great grandparents named Adam and Eve. And then I would have gone into a philosophical, theological discussion about original sin, and that sin and death entered the world because of Adam and Eve's propensity to sin. And each of us has that same propensity of sin. So that man suffers, and we all suffer because of our own desire to rebel against God. And therefore, that is why he's blind. But Jesus doesn't do that. In fact, Jesus makes this weird statement to me. He almost takes the blame. He says, "But this has happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Now, don't over-philosophize this statement. Because I think someone could go, well, so you're saying that people are sick so that God can show off, so that God can heal them and make people want to follow him? I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here. I think what Jesus is doing is he's reframing the conversation. Jesus is moving this from a why conversation to a what conversation. Jesus isn't interested in getting into a philosophical conversation about why the way things are the way they are. He wants to move to what? To what is God up to? What is God gonna do? What is this man gonna do in response to what God is doing? He moves the conversation from a why to a what. And this is what I need to tell you. Fatalism operates in why. Faith operates in the what. Here's what I'm saying. If you suffer, or if you know someone who suffered, or walked alongside someone who suffered, or currently suffering, there's no doubt you're going to ask the why question. And I'd encourage you to ask the why question. You got to wrestle with why, God, are you letting this happen? You got to wrestle with a good God letting bad things happen. We all do, right? But I'm going to tell you, as someone who's walked alongside people suffering, the why is never going to get you anywhere. It might be helpful, it might be cathartic for a moment, but it's never going to get you to the next place. Do you know what gets you to the next place? The what question. The what are you doing, God? The where are you moving? God, what are you up to? God, what are you calling me to do? And how would you like me to respond in this situation? Jesus flips the script on this moment. And he says, guys, you're worried about the why. Let's talk about the what. What's God going to do? How is God going to show up in this man's life? So then, Jesus continues, as long as it is day, Jesus says, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, darkness is coming, when no one can work. But while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So Jesus is setting up this miracle. And he's saying, guys, I'm about to give you a sign of who I am and what I want you to be about. But let me tell you real quick, and this is one of Jesus' I am statements in John. There's 7 of them. He says, I am the light of the world. I'm literally about to help a man go from darkness to light, but I just want that to be a sign to you that the business that I'm in is bringing light. A chapter earlier, I don't know how long in time it was, but before they had reached this place in John 8, verse 12, Jesus spoke again to the people and he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is, again, you got to sit with this for a second, because clearly those who follow Jesus are going to walk in darkness. It's inevitable. They're going to live in a world where it gets dark, and it's going to get actually really dark after Jesus leaves. So how is it possible then that those who follow Jesus will actually never walk in darkness? It's because Jesus is in the business of bringing light. When everything is dark, Jesus says, I am the light. When all the evidence points towards darkness, Jesus says, I am the light. But then don't forget that Jesus also said that we're the light. And perhaps the disciples remembered or recalled this conversation from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and give it light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. This sign that's about to happen is not just a sign for this blind man. This is a teachable moment. This is a laboratory, an exercise that he wants to be cemented in the brains and the minds and the hearts of the disciples. That in the same way this man's about to go from dark to light, that is your job description as followers of Jesus. You are to bring people into the light. You are to be lights in the darkness. So then Jesus continues on, and he does this. There's this next move that Jesus does that kind of reminds me of my middle school and high school days. Ladies, I don't know how women treat each other in middle school and high school. But guys, I think it's true that sometimes in that age range, we kind of like, we'll get into like a pick a fight, or I had friends who would kind of like pick a fight with a bully or start a controversy. And then when it started getting kind of bubbling up, they would push me into it and run and leave me hanging. Did you ever have this happen? Like they'd get the fight started, and then they kind of turn and be like, all right, yeah, he's going to take you, Chris, take care of it. I'm like, what? What do you, this is not I was not a part of this at all. There's this, played soccer in high school, and I was 16, give or take. It's about 35, 40 degrees outside, and before soccer practice had started, some guys were picking on each other, playing. It was starting to get bad. It was starting to turn into a controversy. I was just watching. I was not a part of it, I promise, right? But they're going at each other, and Ryan's picking on these guys, and then two guys kind of gang up on Ryan, and they pull his hoodie over his head so that he can't see, and they tie it real quick, and he's kind of blind for about 10 seconds. And while he's blind, another kid comes up. I mean, it's cold outside, and he smacks Ryan on the rear end as hard as he can. And I mean, you could just tell that it hurt. And then they pushed me towards Ryan and ran away. So when Ryan took off his hat, his hood, the only person standing in front of him was me, right? So Ryan's not happy. So Ryan pulls off, and he punches me square in the mouth. And he broke my front tooth in half. I mean, he exposed the nerve. I took one breath of that cold air, and all of a sudden I was crying like a 2-year-old looking for his mommy. It was so horrifically painful. And I spent the next years and thousands of my parents' dollars, and even into my early 20s, my own dollars, trying to fix this tooth. This is what it looks like when it's not in. It's quite the lovely picture. I sent that first time it fell out in our marriage. This is the picture I sent to Lacey. I was like, are you sure? Because you're stuck with me now. But they started the fight, they picked the fight, and then they kind of pushed me in and let me have the ramifications of the controversy that they started. I think Jesus is almost doing the same thing here. You're going to have to hang with me for a second. But I think this is what Jesus is doing. I think he's intentionally causing a controversy, causing a stir. He's trying to tick off the Pharisees. But then when the controversy explodes and when it starts to get rough, Jesus disappears. But he disappears in order that this blind man is going to have an opportunity to testify to what God has done in his life, to what Jesus did in his life. So John 9, 6 through 7, here's this bizarre scene. After saying this, Jesus, spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it into the man's eyes. Go, he told them, wash in the pool of Siloam. The word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, anytime you come across something in Scripture, something happens, it's a little weird, a little bizarre, you have to ask the question, why is it there? Surely Jesus wasn't just in the mood to make mud pies that day, right? It's like he woke up and said, you know what, I'm going to make some mud pies. And surely, because we know Jesus, there's other miracles where Jesus just spoke. We know in this instance, he could have snapped his fingers and the blind man would have seen. Or if Jesus was really intent on using his saliva, we know there are other miracle accounts where Jesus uses his saliva and just puts it on the person's eyes or ears, and that causes them to be healed. So if he was interested in using his saliva, he could have done that. But instead, he does this weird thing where he spits in the dirt, mixes it together, and then puts it on the man's eyes. Why did he do that? I think Jesus intentionally made mud because he wanted to intentionally break the Sabbath. He was trying to create a controversy. Verse 14 says, now the day on which Jesus had made the mud, not just the day on which Jesus had healed the blind man, but Scripture makes the point to say the day which Jesus made the mud and the day that he opened the eyes of the man was a Sabbath. The Pharisees, 2 verses later, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now, I don't think it was the healing that violated the Sabbath. Healing on the Sabbath, he had done it before, and it had stirred some controversy, but it never created the reaction from the Pharisees that the mud and the healing did on this day. In previous accounts, Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said, wouldn't a shepherd rescue their sheep if it was in trouble? And the Pharisees are like, Jesus, well, then I'm going to heal on the Sabbath. And they walk away and kind of tail tucked between their legs, and they say, we're just going to kill that guy, right? That's their response in those moments. In this story, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but go home, read chapter 9. In this story, the Pharisees launch a full-out investigation of what happened here this day. I mean, they go all out. They interview people. They're causing this whole stir because this is such a big deal. What made this such a big deal? I think it's because Jesus made mud. Now you think, why is that such a big deal? Here's why. Because for the Pharisees, there were 39 laws or prohibited activities, if you would, for the Sabbath. There are things like planting, plowing, reaping, sorting, shearing, dyeing, tying, tearing, curing, like curing meat, killing, like an animal, writing, erasing. All of these are banned. You can't do these, perform these activities on the Sabbath. Even scoring something with a knife. One of them was losh, also in English known as kneading. And kneading is defined as combining particles into a semi-solid or solid mass via liquid. And you might think of dough, and you would be right. But the law is clear. It includes food and non-food substances. So if you were to use mud to make a brick, that would be prohibited on the Sabbath. You get what I'm saying? Jesus, it seems to me, and this is my opinion, you read it, you see what you think. But Jesus, it seems to me, does the mud making to intentionally break the Sabbath. And then what happens after it is what I take to be Jesus' will. And what happens afterwards is that this blind man is going to be investigated. No less than 6 times the Pharisees are going to pull him aside and say, what happened? And every time he's going to get an opportunity to testify to what Jesus did in his life. I think Jesus stirred up this controversy because he wanted the blind man to get the practice of telling people about the light that he was seeing. That he had gone from darkness into light. I mean, the Pharisees even interviewed this guy's parents, and his parents were like, yeah, he was blind. They're like, is he blind? Well, he was from birth. And they're like, well, who healed him? And they're like, I don't know. They won't talk about it. But read the man's responses. Every time he gets a little bit bolder and bolder in his response. So much so that in his last response to the Pharisees, this is what they said to him. They said, you were steeped in sin at birth. Talking back, you were born in sin because you're a sinner. How dare you lecture us? And they kick him out of the temple. And then in verse 35, do you know who's waiting there for him? Any guesses? Jesus. I just see Jesus like back here like watching over the fence. Like, yeah, go get him. Right? Then Jesus approaches this man and he reveals who he really is to this man. He gives them the understanding of who he really is. And here's why I think all of this happens. Because I think Jesus wants us to see that when you see the light, you speak into the dark. This blind man went from, it is what it is, to it is not what it is. And Jesus creates an opportunity for him to testify to that truth 6 times within hours of him seeing the light. And he testified, he said, I don't know if this man is a sinner or who he is, but one thing I can tell you, I was blind and now I see. Can I ask you something? What happens when followers of Jesus stop testifying to the light? What happens when followers of Jesus stop testifying that there's a God who can change it? When they stop being people of hope? What happens when the people who follow Jesus sound just as despondent, just as fatalistic, just as cynical as the rest of the broader culture? I'll tell you, Christianity becomes irrelevant. And I think the broader culture loses its capacity for hope. I think this culture, the United States of America, has benefited from a core of Christians at its center who for centuries have declared there is hope. They haven't always done it perfectly, but the larger culture has a sense of hope because the people of Jesus at the core have proclaimed that that's true. And I'm just going to tell you, I think part of what's happening in our culture today is that the people who follow Jesus are not so sure that God can make a difference. They're not so sure that there is light. But we who follow Jesus, we should be testifying to the light. When we see the light, we should speak into the darkness. Now, I think if I was sitting where you were, and I'm often cynical of preachers and pastors because I am one, I would be thinking, all right, so this guy, this pastor just wants us to tell people about Jesus. Well, that's true. I do want you to tell people about Jesus. That's a good thing. But I think it's more than just telling people about Jesus. I think what we're looking for is for followers of Jesus who are seeing the signs of what God is doing. And when they see that, it increases their faith like it did for the blind man. And they testify to the light. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. What you need to know is that when the Bible talks about faith, pistis, its understanding of faith is that it's something that God gives to humanity. Humans can't muster up this type of faith on their own. It's not like, you gotta like get yourself hyped up to go to work or hyped up to go to the gym. You gotta get get all worked up, get my adrenaline flowing. Faith is not like that. You don't go, all right, gotta get my faith up, gotta muster up more faith to believe in what God is doing. The way that the New Testament talks about faith is that it is a gift that God gives. And what I think we need is Christians, followers of Jesus, who are saying, God, increase our faith. Give us more faith so that we can believe that you're at work. Give us signs that increase our faith so that we can proclaim into a dark world that it is not what it is. At Christmas time, my kids, their elementary school had like a little Christmas toy fair. They is a fundraiser for the PTA, and what the PTA does, and no offense to them, but they order cheap junk from OrientalTraining.com and from the dollar store. And then they put it on a table and they mark it up about 400 to 500% and sell it to kids to raise money for the PTA. Again, it's a good cause, whatever. But I'm not giving my kids money to go buy this stuff, all right? Lacey, she's not either. She is cheap as cheap comes. And me, I am a price hunter. So I will not buy anything in a store for the most part until I have checked it on Amazon Prime. And if I can get it $1 cheaper and it comes in 36 hours, I will do it, all right? Because no one's going to make me pay more for something than it's worth. But my kids are hounding us. They want money. They want money to do this, to buy gifts. So fine. So we gave in. So I gave my son $20 to buy me a Christmas gift. Now you see what's wrong here, right? And not only is it my money that he's buying me a gift for, but he's buying me something that I do not want. And honestly, something that I feel like this is not worth it. It's a ripoff. Whatever, right? You get the picture, right? So on Christmas morning, he was so excited about this thing that for a week, I can't believe he made it to Christmas without showing it to me. And on Christmas morning, he unwraps with me this gift, and he gives me this. It says, "Number one dad." This cost him $20. I never wanted a number one dad trophy, and I've told enough stories in this place for you to know that I'm not a number one dad. So this is a lie. But I'm telling you, this gift means more to me than I can possibly express. It made me tear up. I love it. It sits on my dresser, and it ain't going nowhere. Every time we do a clean out, that thing stays right where it is. Why? It was my money. I gave him the money to buy that thing. But he gave it back. I don't know how faith works, to be honest with you. I probably should. I'm a pastor. But I just don't understand how it works. But I think it's a little bit like this. I think God gives us faith that we give it back to him, that we use it to know him and to make him known. And so what I'm challenging you to think about today is praying, God, would you give me more of that faith? I'm asking you to pray a prayer like, God, would you give me a sign? Might not be the healing of a blind man, but God, would you show me where you're at work? Move me from the why to the what, God. Increase my faith that I might see you at work, that I might see the light, and then I have the confidence, the assurance, the faith to testify to that light, to those around me. So, will you join me in praying a prayer like that? And being a people who does not say, it is what it is, but being a people who proclaim by faith, faith that comes from God, that it is not what it is. Let's pray together. God, thank you for this day. Thank you that you are the giver of faith, and we ask that you increase our faith. Give us signs that you're at work. Show us where you're at work, and help us to join you at work, God. Let us be people who testify to the light, who declare it is not what it is. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Now, before we go, let's check out a couple announcements.